Thank you. You won't notice anything.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have the great honor to welcome at the Société Française Shakespeare two very distinguished speakers, Richard Eyre and Peter Smith. So Richard Eyre is an English film, theatre, television and opera director. He was director of the National Theatre in London between 1987 and 1997. His most noted theatre productions include Hamlet, two productions of Hamlet actually, one at the Royal Court in 1980 with Jonathan Pryce and Kevin Quamby, who was with us yesterday, and one with Daniel Day-Lewis in 1989. Also Richard III with Ian McKellen, King Lear with Ian Holm in 1997. His production of King Lear won the award for Best Actor for Ian Holm and Best Director in the Evening Standard Awards, the London Theatre Critics Award and the Laurence Olivier Awards. The production was filmed and broadcast on the BBC's performance series. Among all the films Richard Eyre directed, I would like to mention in particular a film which dates back to 2004, Stage Beauty, a period drama about the very beginning of the Restoration period in England, and more particularly about actor Edward Kynaston, a male actor who specialized in female roles and who ran out of a job when professional actresses came into the spotlight by royal decree in 1662. Richard Eyre also directed Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, as part of the BBC's The Hologram series in 2012, and King Lear for the BBC 2, which was broadcast in May 2018, quite recently then, with a star-studded cast, because the film stars Anthony Hopkins in the role of Lear, Emma Thompson as Goneril, and Emily Watson as Regan, among others. Now, this is the film we're going to focus on today. Richard Eyre was made an officier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in 1998, and I just learned that he was presented to this together with Jeanne Moreau.
No, Jeanne presented me.
Oh, she presented you, sorry. All right, she presented you. And he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters by the University of Nottingham in July 2008. And the University of Nottingham is one of his connections with our other guest, Peter Smith, because Peter Smith is reader in Renaissance literature at the University of Nottingham Trent. He's the author of Social Shakespeare, Aspects of Renaissance Dramaturgy and Contemporary Society, which was published by Macmillan in 1995. And Between Two Stools, Scatology and its Representations in English Literature, Chaucer to Swift, published by MUP, Manchester University Press, in 2012. He's co-editor of Hamlet, Theory and Practice, and Much Ado About Nothing, and a critical reader, and his essays and reviews have appeared in Cahiers Élisabétain, Critical Survey, Renaissance Quarterly, Shakespeare, Shakespeare Bulletin, Shakespeare Survey, Times Higher Education, and Year's Work in English Studies. He's co-editor-in-chief of Cahiers Élisabétain and a former trustee of the British Shakespeare Association. Peter has just completed an essay on Richard Eyre's King Lear for BBC 2 that is part of a book on King Lear co-edited by Sarah Hatchell and Nathalie Guérin in their collection Shakespeare on Screen at Cambridge University Press, to be published later this year. He's going to lead this conversation with Richard Eyre on King Lear. And some of you may not have seen the film yet, but Peter has planned to screen a few extracts, and of course you will be given an opportunity to ask questions directly to Richard in the second part of this conversation. So Pete, if you'd like to start this conversation.
Lovely. Do I need some equipment?
Thank you.
Could I have a slide, please? That's the first.
Right.
For Richard's responses, does that one work?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Technology is not my thing, as you can see. So very pleased and honoured to be here. Thank you to the French Shakespeare Society for inviting me and for putting me together with one of my all-time theatre heroes, Sir Richard Eyre. This started, as Florence was saying, because Sarah and Natalie wrote to me with very short notice, about 24 hours, because I didn't know, Richard, that your King Lear was being screened by the BBC in May. And they wrote to me and said, would I write something? And I did, and I thought on spec, as I always do, I'll send it off to the people involved and see if I get any feedback. And usually, as you know, when academics write to theatricals, you very rarely hear anything back. Richard was back to me within about 24 hours with his production notes, his original proposal to the BBC, and then I had a sort of brief conversation with him over email, and he was extremely helpful about answering various queries I had about the film. So I'm very, very grateful to you, Richard, for that, because I know how horribly busy your day-to-day life actually is. Before we come to the film of King Lear, about which I have my own theories, you'll be pleased to hear, from which Richard completely dissents. I think the whole thing's about Brexit, and he thinks it's nothing to do with that. I think the whole thing's about Steptoe and Son, and he says I've never even thought of that. So, however, but before we come to that, what I wanted to do is to frame this film in the context of what I see as being Richard's larger project, and as well as the grueling schedule of running 3 national theatres, the Cottesloe, as it then was, the Olivier and the Littleton, as well as running those, planning, budgets, marketing, all of the stuff that the artistic director has to oversee, not least budget responsibilities and fundraising, but also directing his own shows and films, and then going to the theatre probably every night of the week, in addition to keep up with current trends. But one thing that struck me throughout Richard's canon, if I can call it that, is a commitment which is brought out very clearly, I think, in this King Lear, which is to do with a commitment of the theatre to politics. So I want to go back to a film that Richard directed with playwright and poet Tony Harrison, a film called V, based on a long narrative poem by Harrison, which he wrote during the miners' strike. And I think one of the things that we need to be conscious of and grateful for is Richard's determination in the teeth of 10 or 15 years of right-wing Philistinism, of managing to champion the cause of the National Theatre. And it's through projects like Tony Harrison's V and Charles Wood's Falklands script, Tumbledown, which Richard also directed for the screen, which I think is so important. And I wanted just to read a very short passage just to get us going from Richard's Utopia and Other Places. It's a book of 3 long essays about his parents and about theatre and about directing. But this comes from the essay called Misdirection. And I'll ask you, Richard, to comment on this, perhaps in the light of what I've been saying. He writes, "It's impossible for a director to stage a play without revealing something of his politics. Even the most innocent of drawing room comedies reflects the view of the world that a director can endorse or criticize in a number of subtle or indiscreet ways. By making choices about design, costume, and performances, it's impossible not to be taking a view about how people live, about how they behave, about how they are influenced by what they earn, where they were born, and what they believe in. To affect a lack of interest in these matters is no less a political position than that of the Queen, who claims to be above politics. Alan Parker said of Ken Loach, whose films, however artful, always have a sense of life being artlessly observed. I ask how he gets such reality, such honesty. Ken always says, it's nothing to do with the how, it's to do with the why." Richard, could you comment a bit about how you see the relationship between directing and the arts and politics?
Yes. Is this working? I have to put it on. Is that working? And actually, it's a small room, and I could do without it. But we're recording this, and this is live broadcast on YouTube. Well, really, it's what I said is that people say of a lot of British theatre that it has no politics. Because if you approach it from the perspective of régie théâtre, which you see that it's a sort of virus that infects a lot of European theatre, and particularly virulently in Germany, where the director is king, and he or she just imposes a conceit on the production, happens universally in opera. And so what you're looking at is simply the play through the lens of a director. And when I did a production of Richard III with Ian McKellen in 1992, and we brought it to my favorite theatre in the world, which is the Odeon in Luxembourg. And it had been previously, we went to Hamburg, and I remember a big headline in German newspaper saying, revelation, director puts actor at the center of event. And I thought, wow, that's a revelation. Now, to me, what's wonderful about theatre is that it can deal with a whole society and the relationship between an individual and society, because it all works through metaphor. So you can put a group of 6, 8 people on stage, and they stand for a whole society. And you can see, in my view, the greatest play of the 20th century was Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, in which he does literally, and if you break it down, it seems sort of shockingly schematic, that he's got a person who represents every single level of the social scale in Russia in 1905. And yet, through his genius, you never feel that you're watching a piece of polemic. So for me, it's always about, theatre is essentially political, because it's about the relationship between, you know, families, it's dialectical. It presents you with, you know, opposites. I mean, that's the nature of drama, is dialectical. So at its most extreme, you see it in Brecht, who obviously adored theatre, defied every single canon of his advertised program. And also at heart, two things about the theatre. One is that it's ineradicably human, that there is nothing you can do in the theatre that absolves you from the fact that at the heart of the art form is a human being of, you know, roughly between 2 meters and 1.2, you know, I mean, human size and human voice. And theatre, by definition, it's an interaction between live human beings and a human being on stage. So that is essentially a political relationship. It's a social relationship. And that distinguishes it from any other dramatic medium. And it's one of the reasons that people say to me, oh, do you think theatre is going to die? And for years, you know, I've been told, oh, theatre is dead, it's dead. And I think, well, why is it that more and more people seem to be coming to the theatre? And it's absolutely astonishing, precisely because it gives you that relationship, and it gives you a sense of the politics, with a small p, of quotidian life.
I mean, the idea of it engaging with a particular social fabric, or at a particular particular place in time, is obviously, and brings us on to the next problem or issue, I think, which I'd like to hear from you about, which is to do with the distinction between theatre as being essentially ephemeral. You write somewhere in your diaries that the poor old Kenneth Tynan was condemned to writing about the ephemeral. I think he said he was writing postcards to the future, but anyhow, the difference between a theatre production which is dismantled, and you talk about how you like seeing the whole thing taken to pieces, how you like it completed and vanishing into thin air kind of idea, and the difference between that and the permanence that film offers. You're very able to conduct yourself directorially in these two quite distinct positions of the ephemerality of theatre and the permanence of film. And I know you say somewhere you're uncomfortable about filming drama for television.
I'm very uncomfortable. I don't like this increasing habit of televising and broadcasting theatre events, because theatre exists in the present tense. If you aren't there, you haven't experienced it. And that's the nature of it. So when you film it, you aren't there. It's something other. And I know the argument by politicians is that it's very valuable and we want to fund it because it justifies funding culture, because it can be seen. You do a production in Paris and you can be in Nîmes and be watching production. I just can't watch it. It always looks to me like inferior film or inferior television. I like to be there. And film is an altogether different medium. It has a different time, exists in a different time-space continuum. And I don't think I've ever made a film that... I'm very interested in Bresson as a director. Bresson wrote a wonderful book which is full of aphorisms about filmmaking. It's called Notes to a Cinematographer, or Notes on Cinematography. Anyway, Robert Bresson, you know more about than I do. Anyway, and he says somewhere that there are very few films that aren't filmed theatre, by which he meant in some way dialogue dependent, in some way depending on a narrative that is derived from theatrical sources. And very, very few films actually are created in a medium of pure film. And I don't think I've ever, and I don't think like that. And I think it's wonderful when you see a film that is created in that way. There's a recent film that it's on Netflix. You get Netflix, but Roma by Alfonso Cuarón. It is the most beautiful film, and that I think would fit Bresson's category of a pure film. But I'm sorry, I haven't really answered it.
I suppose what I'm asking you to talk to us about, Richard, is what you see as the distinctions between being a theatre director and being a film director. How does your job, do you think, differ from the one medium to the other? Let's leave the live screenings and the televised versions to one side, but you do theatre, and you do film. What's the distinction, do you think, in terms of your job?
In terms of practice, there's a massive distinction. I think in some ways the worst possible training for a film director is to work in the theatre, because you're used to a fixed point of view.
Right.
So you sit watching the actors and you have a sort of, whatever it is, 130-degree angle of vision, and you're concentrating on essentially a framework that it's three-dimensional but has an unchanging point of view. You can sort of shift emphases, by changing the scene, by lighting. So. Whereas with film, the director is constantly changing the audience's point of view, visually and verbally. And this was illustrated perfectly to me the first film I directed, which was a script by Ian McEwan, and the year was 1980. And it was just before I directed the first production I did of Hamlet. And it was a film actually called The Imitation Game. And it was about Turing, the mathematician. And I was rehearsing a scene with the cinematographer, and he was standing next to me, and then he moved off and moved behind the actors. And I thought, I don't know, what is he doing? And then he beckoned to me, and I went round to where he was at, and I immediately saw that the scene was much more interesting if you were looking at their backs than if you were looking, and it was just my theatrical instinct was, well, the audience have got to see it. And I then started, and it took a long time to realize how you can move the camera around, how sound, and in the theatre, your instinct is always to want to look at the person who's speaking. And in film, it's so often not the person who's speaking, it's the person who's reacting. And there are people who say, well, acting on film is not a matter of acting, it's a matter of reacting. So you've got to change your whole mental topography when working on film. I suppose what they have in common is that you're used to essentially the raw material of film is, you know, the soft material for the actors. So you're very used to the practice of working with actors and speaking in a language that actors understand. And the other thing you're used to doing is dealing with narrative and clarity of narrative, and constantly asking yourself, what does this mean? What are they saying? And the other thing I suppose that unites is that all good art is specific, is detailed, and all bad art is generalized. It's generalities. And so you get, you know, the practice is to deal in specifics.
I think it's that level of detail that I'd like to move on to. It's to do with, if I can just read you briefly, it was Ralph Fiennes talking in an interview about directing Coriolanus, and he was talking to one of your great theatrical inspirations, Peter Brook. And Ralph Fiennes says, when Brook made his film of King Lear, he felt that cinema does not tolerate anything that's overtly theatrical, so in a way that you've just been saying. It has to be naturalistic. And Kenneth Branagh is also on record as talking about striving for a naturalistic quality. It might be time here to think about naturalism and also to move us on to King Lear. So I'm going to show, if I may, the first 7 minutes or so, just to give our audience a sense of what the film looks like. And now, can I do the technology? Okay. I hope I've got this right.
Yeah.